The Senate race in Pennsylvania has become surprisingly close over the past couple of weeks, with Bob Casey's lead in the polls dropping from around 7 just a few weeks ago down to about 3.4 in the RCP average. So in today's video, we're going to talk about why the Pennsylvania Senate race has tightened over in the last couple of weeks, why Bob Casey is still the favorite here in Pennsylvania. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second, but first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So it's no secret that Bob Casey is the favorite in Pennsylvania. He's been the senator here since 2007, with his smallest margin of victory being about 9 percentage points back in 2012. Now, this is only the second time in Bob Casey's career that he's going to have to run on the same ticket as a presidential nominee while running for Senate. So back in 2012, Barack Obama won Pennsylvania by around 5 points. Bob Casey won by around 9. So he overperformed the top of the ticket by about 4 points. This time around, he's overperforming Kamala Harris in the polls by 3 points. The top of the ticket contest between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, a dead tie. So this race has tightened up over the past few weeks, mainly because McCormick has been really killing it in terms of the TV ad game and in terms of diverting money into his election, because Pennsylvania is now rapidly becoming the most expensive Senate race in the entire country, because both parties understand that this state is very critical to holding on or even expanding the majority. Because if we take a look at the state of the Senate right now, Republicans are on track to gain 52 seats. Democrats are on track to get 47. Now, with the races shaping up as they are right now, Democrats probably win Pennsylvania by a lean margin. That puts the Senate at 52-48. So Democrats desperately need Pennsylvania if they want to limit the power of a Republican majority. Now, what's fascinating about this is that we're talking about Pennsylvania and we're not so much talking about Michigan or Wisconsin. And that's mainly because the polling shows that Pennsylvania is actually much more competitive than both of these states put together. Now, I think one of the reasons for that is that Dave McCormick has done a very good job in tying Bob Casey to national Democrats and to Kamala Harris in particular. When Joe Biden was the nominee, he was heavily hammering on Bob Casey's connections to Joe Biden. But I think now that you have Kamala Harris as the nominee, it obviously changes the dynamic of the race. Even though Donald Trump was leading Joe Biden by around 4 points on the day he dropped out of the presidential contest, Bob Casey was beating Dave McCormick by around 7. So the race has rapidly taken a much more competitive turn. Now, I think this was inevitable, mainly because of the fact that Pennsylvania is probably likely going to be the deciding state of the 2024 election. So a lot of resources are being put here. And because Republicans are putting more resources into McCormick's campaign, it's making the race that much more competitive. Dave McCormick's team, I think, is one of the most competent Republican teams across the entire country when we're talking about battleground Senate races. Because if we just take a brief overview at the other Republican nominees, characters like Carrie Lake, for example, in Arizona, Bernie Moreno in Ohio, they're massively underperforming where they should be. Dave McCormick is overperforming expectations because earlier on in the election season, many forecasters had Pennsylvania going to Bob Casey by 7, 8, some cases even 10 points. Now we're looking at a low single digits margin of victory, which is, I think, a moral victory for Republicans, but obviously there's no substitute for actual victory. The McCormick campaign is going to try to drive their message home. And now that we're post-Labor Day, a lot more attention has been focused on the election itself. We had the debate the other night. So a lot more people are now paying attention to the election, and that's why you're seeing this shift in the polls. Now, I think the real question in 2024 is whether or not we still have this shy Trump voter factor when it comes to the polls, and Donald Trump and Republican support is going to be underestimated, or like we had in the midterms, Democratic support is going to be underestimated. Now, there is a third option, and that is the polls are fairly accurate. In some states like Georgia, for example, that's usually the case. I think Donald Trump is up by 0.3 in Georgia right now over Kamala Harris, which, you know, if the polls were to be accurate, that would give Donald Trump an incredibly narrow margin of victory. But Pennsylvania is critical in regards to not just the presidential contest, but the Senate. And I think that's why you're seeing this race come so close. Now, back in 2022, we almost had Dave McCormick be the Republican nominee. He lost to Dr. Oz in the primary by less than 1,000 votes. And his biggest areas of strength are where he was from, Western Pennsylvania. And this is actually an area where Dr. Oz really struggled to gain traction in 2022. And it's one of the reasons why he lost by a whopping 5 points in a race that the polling had him favored to win. Now, if we take a look at the counties around Allegheny, and we could take a look at Allegheny County itself, Fetterman won here 63-35. Joe Biden only won Allegheny County by 60-39. So it was really just a 21-point margin for Joe Biden as opposed to a 28-point margin for John Fetterman. So that's also where Fetterman's from. He's from Western PA. But if we take a look at the outer counties around Allegheny, and this is an area that nets Republicans around 100,000 votes. Westmoreland County, Fayette County, Washington, all counties where Dr. Oz underperformed. Westmoreland County, he was only able to get 58%. Fayette County, 60%. Washington, 56%. If we take a look at 2020, Donald Trump got 63% of the vote in Westmoreland, 66% in Fayette, and 61% in Washington. So Dr. Oz not only underperformed Donald Trump in Western PA, but he also underperformed in the critical Philadelphia suburbs. And this is the region of the state that's really going to decide not just how Pennsylvania votes, but obviously also how the election could end up unfolding. And I think this is an area of weakness for Republicans in general, because the Philadelphia collar counties had always been more socially liberal, fiscally conservative, and it's one of the reasons why they haven't voted for a Republican nominee for president since 1988. And even in 2016, when Donald Trump won the state of Pennsylvania as a whole, Hillary Clinton still carried every one of the Philadelphia collar counties. Bucks County was the closest. She still was able to win that by less than a point. So ultimately, this is going to be a tough part of the state. Now, as 2016 showed, you don't need to win the Philadelphia collar counties to win the state, but you do need to narrow up the margins. And the margins that Donald Trump got back in 2020 were the reason why he lost. You know, losing places like Chester County by 17 points, Bucks County by 4, Montgomery County 62-36, Delaware County 62-36. These are not numbers that a Republican can get and still end up winning the state as a whole. I mean, you would need an incredible shift to the right in places like Luzerne, Lackawanna, Monroe County, Lancaster, so on and so forth. It's just not going to happen. So Dave McCormick, I think an area he could potentially do better in than Donald Trump is the suburb. Potentially see Dave McCormick do a few points better in Chester County, a few points better in Bucks County, a little bit better in Montgomery County, but the rural parts of the state might be stagnant for him, or he might actually do worse, because that has been a strong suit of Bob Casey's going back to his first election victory, winning a number of rural Pennsylvania counties. Now, what's different about this race, obviously, is that this is the first time that Bob Casey has been polling really within single digits. I mean, he's only up 3.4, as we pointed out earlier. The latest poll has Bob Casey up by 8 points. Never really heard of this poll. Morning Consult is much more well-known. This is a 9-point margin. CNN poll has the race at a dead heat. So when you average these polls together, you get Bob Casey up by around 3.4. Now, again, this is mainly because Republicans have put tens of millions of dollars into the state. Now, conventional wisdom would have told you not to do that, because this was going to be a very tough state to flip. And I still think Bob Casey is the clear favorite, but it seems like if the polls continue to trend in this direction, this big investment in Pennsylvania is paying off for the GOP. And with somebody like Donald Trump tied with Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, I think you could see this race become a 3 to 4 point race, as opposed to what it was earlier, which was a 7 to 8 point race. So I'm not saying by any means that Dave McCormick is going to win this race. I think Bob Casey is the clear favorite, but it does show you that running a strong candidate like Dave McCormick, and, you know, I do think he has some of his problems. You know, obviously he's got ties to Connecticut and things like that. That's something that hurt Dr. Oz when it came to New Jersey. I'm sure Bob Casey is running on that. Bob Casey is also running a lot on abortion. So, you know, there are some weaknesses that this candidate has, but, you know, by and large, Dave McCormick is sort of this Republican unifier. He has Donald Trump's endorsement. He has George W. Bush's endorsement. He has the endorsement of a lot of establishment Republicans, and he has the endorsement of a lot of MAGA Republicans. So, in a lot of ways, Dave McCormick is sort of like a Glenn Youngkin figure, in the sense that he's able to basically make both wings of the party happy. Now, at the end of the day, in a state like Pennsylvania, a state that typically leans blue, that might not be enough. But if Dave McCormick only loses by a couple of points, it's because he ran an exceptional campaign and really unified the entire Republican base behind him. Now, looking at the Senate map as a whole, again, I think Pennsylvania is going to be a tough flip for Republicans, but it's very interesting that Pennsylvania is the state that we're focusing on, where Bob Casey is a very strong incumbent, and we're not really focusing on Wisconsin and Michigan. I think the main reason for that is that you have a candidate quality difference here. Dave McCormick is a very exceptional candidate from what I've seen so far, and that's why he's been able to drag Bob Casey, who, out of all of these candidates, out of Wisconsin, Nevada, he was the candidate that should have performed the best and has historically performed the best in his election performances. That's why this race has been brought down to low single digits, while places like Wisconsin, you have Tammy Baldwin up by like 7 points over Eric Hovde. And in Nevada, you have Jackie Rosen beating her Republican opponent by like 5 points. So it's really fascinating that Pennsylvania has become the closest of these races. I think it's just because of the major investment you're getting from national groups on both sides. I think Bob Casey is now having to play defense, whereas before he was able to play offense because he was massively ahead in the polls. He really didn't need to focus too much on the election, but to his credit, he has been doing a lot of campaigning, and, you know, he's very unabashed about his support for Kamala Harris, and before that, Joe Biden. So he's very much tied to the National Democratic Party in a way that I think he hasn't been in years past. So that could be another reason why this race is becoming so close. Now, at the end of the day, I think at this point, Bob Casey wins by 4-5. So I would now move this race down to the lean Democratic column. But I think this was always sort of an inevitable change because the top of the ticket race was always going to be close. And I expect Bob Casey to outrun Kamala Harris by several points. So if Kamala Harris wins Pennsylvania by, let's say, 2-3, I would expect Bob Casey to win by 4-5. We still have 50 plus days until the election, but, you know, this is the way the Pennsylvania Senate race is shaping up. We're going to talk about places like Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, and Arizona as we get closer to the election. We might also talk about Texas. Even if Kamala Harris becomes president, and let's say even if Democrats win the state of Ohio very narrowly, the Republicans still take the Senate even if Kamala Harris is president with a 51-49 majority. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. As always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.